Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Montana Book Festival event, Sensational, the Hidden History of America's Girl Stunt Reporters, sponsored by Arts Missoula and Montana Press Monthly. My name is Kim Barry, and I am a volunteer host for the Montana Book Festival, and we are all so happy to have you here today. I want to read the territorial acknowledgement that we've come up with for the book festival. This is my first time reading it out loud, so I apologize for some of the pronunciations. The Montana Book Festival acknowledges that we are in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and the Kalispel people. The name Missoula comes from the Bitterroot Salish word Nijhuis, which means place of freezing water. This name has been used for over 12,000 years since the existence of Glacial Lake Missoula. The first Europeans who came here borrowed the Salish term Nzelikt and modified the word to Missoula. Later, when Glacial Lake Missoula melted, Bitterroot Salish began using an additional term for Missoula, Nijhuis, which means place of the small bull trout. In 1855, the Bitterroot Salish were forced to sign the Hellgate Treaty. Following the treaty, the United States government carried out forced assimilation, removal, and genocide against the Salish people and other peoples in their effort to acquire land. Yet despite centuries of colonial theft and oppression, the Tatiachan people are still here and thriving on their Aboriginal lands. The Montana Book Festival strives and will continue to strive to help promote Indigenous voices as one of the ways our organization acknowledges and respects the Aboriginal peoples of Montana and Missoula. So for those joining from outside Missoula today, I would encourage you to take a look at the native land link that will be posted in the chat to see which Aboriginal territories you are currently occupying. So today we'll be reserving the last few minutes, probably 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So make sure to drop any questions that you have in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. We also encourage you to take advantage of the chat to engage with each other and to ask any logistical questions that may come up or questions about buying books. Myself and other Montana Book Festival accounts will be posting links for books and we'll be there in the back end to help with any questions you have. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Michelle Nijhuis, who will be moderating today's discussion. Michelle Nijhuis is the author of the new book, Beloved Beasts, Fighting for Life in an Age of Extinction, a history of the modern conservation movement. A project editor at The Atlantic, she is also a longtime contributing editor at High Country News and an award-winning reporter whose work has been published in the National Geographic and in the New York Times Magazine. She lives in White Salmon, Washington, and you can find out more information on her website, rhymeswithmyhouse.com.
Rookie mistake, I unmuted myself. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Kim. It's really a pleasure to be here. I am so delighted and honored to be in conversation with two wonderful writers this afternoon. First, we have Gwen Florio, who is the author of the Lola Wicks crime series, the Nora Best Mysteries, and Silent Hearts, a standalone novel set in Afghanistan. She is a longtime journalist. She won the Pinkley Prize for debut crime fiction and a High Plains Book Award for her first novel, Montana. She lives in Missoula, Montana. Welcome, Gwen. And our guest of honor this afternoon is Kim Todd, who is the award-winning author of several delightful books, including the one we'll be discussing today, Sensational, which is the hidden history, subtitled The Hidden History of America's Girl Stunt Reporters. She's also the author of Chrysalis, Maria Sibylla Marion and the Secrets of Metamorphosis, and Tinkering with Eden, a Natural History of Exotic Species in America, the winner of the Penn Gerard Award and the Sigurd Olson Nature Writing Award. Her essays and articles have appeared in Smithsonian Salon, Sierra Orion, and Best American Science and Nature Writing anthologies, among other publications. She is a member of the MFA faculty at the University of Minnesota and lives in Minneapolis with her family, and she is also a former Missoulian. So Kim, your book is so interesting, and it's called A Hidden History, but the characters you write about are they're hidden in plain sight, because I think we'll hear about some famous names this afternoon, but your book rescues them because they have been hidden in a way behind stereotypes. Their work has been dismissed as unserious or irresponsible, and you take a second look at their careers and look at their place in the history of journalism and in the history of public storytelling of all kinds. I think you're going to start us off with a short reading, and then maybe you can tell us a little bit about the genesis of the book, because it's quite a departure from your previous work. And I'm personally curious about how you discovered these stories and how you came to dig into them so deeply.
Yes, I will definitely start off with the reading, which I think is sort of the shortcut way to explain what the book is about. But I would like also just to say, Michelle and Gwen, thank you so much for being on this panel with me. And thank you to everyone who came to listen. And please think of some questions, because these are always much better as a conversation rather than sort of one-way talking. But yeah, so I'm just going to read from the opening, where I hope I gave a preview of what I was thinking about with the book. So here goes. In late November 1888, a young woman threaded her way through the grit-filled streets of Chicago's downtown, skirting horse-drawn cabs and wagons teetering under sacks of grain. When she finally arrived at the doctor's office, she sat hot-faced in the waiting room while her companion pulled the doctor aside and explained the nature of the problem. The physician, small and alert like a sparrow, turned to the girl and tried to calm her. "You must not be scared about it," the doctor urged. "It's perfectly safe. You suffer more from fright than you would from the operation." The patient, still agitated, put off a full examination. She'd come back another day, she promised, to arrange the abortion. A few days later, the young woman visited a different doctor. This one had a German accent and a diploma from a German university under crossed swords on the wall. She described her situation, saying she was from Memphis, and like many girls, she'd taken the train to Chicago because of its reputation. Then she haltingly made her request. Did she have any other health problems, the doctor asked? Was she in pain? When she said no to both, he wrote her a prescription for ergot, a fungus thought to induce premature labor. She should go to her hotel, he said, draw a warm bath, drink a hot toddy, and take 2 teaspoonsful. Don't follow the dosage instructions on the prescription, the doctor warned, because it was wrong. Otherwise, the pharmacist might get suspicious about the drug's true purpose. The physician looked her in the eye, handed her the slip of paper, and said, "Remember how to take it tonight. Do not be alarmed if it causes pain," and then sent her back out into the hectic city. She went to another doctor after that, and another. In the course of 3 weeks, she visited more than 200 physicians. Many agreed to perform an abortion, a surprising number, as it was illegal. Though one physician suspected she was an adventuress, none knew she was actually an undercover reporter bent on revealing the extent of the city's abortion practice. When her expose, a month-long project for the Chicago Times, hit the stands, the city editor quit in disgust. Letters of praise and outrage flooded the news desk. Lawsuits for libel piled high. Discussion of abortion in a daily paper, readers found it repellent and irresistible. They also found the message hard to decipher. On the one hand, the writer, referred to only as the girl reporter, condemned abortion in the strongest terms. On the other, she published detailed instructions for how and where to get one, including which medicines to take and what dosage. A heated discussion blazed through the editorial pages about women's bodies and the power imbalance between the sexes. The Chicago Times girl reporter might seem exceptional in her readiness to risk scandal to tell a story no one would, but she was not alone. The same script was playing out from coast to coast. She was just one of the nation's girl stunt reporters pioneering a new genre of investigative journalism, going undercover to reveal societal ills. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, women from Colorado to Missouri to Massachusetts dressed in shabby clothes and sneaked into textile mills to report on factory conditions, slipped behind the scenes at corrupt adoption agencies, fainted in the street to test treatment at public hospitals. So I got sucked into this topic because I was reading 10 Days in a Madhouse by Nellie Bly, which is her account of spending 10 days in Blackwell's insane asylum for women in 1887, which she did for Joseph Pulitzer's The World, and was like a huge sensation when she published it and sold many copies. And so when it struck me that how much her style of writing was what I had thought of as being pioneered by Tom Wolfe in the 1960s and 1970s under the term new journalism. She was using scenes, she was using dialogue, she had this distinct point of view, which she really highlighted as part of new journalism. And the other was that while I had heard of Bly and admired her work, what I didn't realize was that she inspired like this decade of women wanting to be girl stunt reporters and doing this kind of undercover work, and editors being really eager to hire them because these kind of exposés sold so many copies of the paper. So that kind of got me launched into what I thought would be a handful, and then just turned out to be more and more and more as I went further.
And some of them were well known, but some of them worked anonymously, correct? Like the young woman who you start and end the book with.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the, a book project, as you both know, is usually prompted by questions that you have. And so I had a number of questions. One was, how much were these women really in charge of their destinies versus being exploited by editors? And certainly both cases were put forward. But the other was like, who was this girl reporter of the Chicago Times? Because most of the women wrote under pseudonyms, like Nellie Bly is a pseudonym for Elizabeth Cochran. But most of them, at least the more famous ones, like we know who is behind the pseudonym, but the girl reporter for the Chicago Times never stood up to claim that name and that story. So I was curious to see if I could figure out who she was.
So one thing we should make clear right at the beginning is that this kind of undercover reporting is certain things about it are now considered unethical and are not done. However, there is a legacy of what is today called immersive reporting, where people are immersing themselves in the situation while disclosing that they are a journalist and they are taking notes. Gwen, as a daily reporter and editor, maybe you could speak a little bit more to how the ethics have changed around this kind of work in journalism. Oh.
How about if I unmute myself first? Yeah, it would be really unethical now to do that. And in many ways, that's made reporting more difficult, but it's also made it, I think, more trustworthy. Your reporters really rely a lot on documents now. They rely on first-person interviews, actually being there on scene. And I think that gives great credibility to it. In fact, you'll see a lot of investigative projects explaining how the reporters got the story, again, to be perfectly transparent. But I was looking for examples of something that might come close to this. And the best example I found was a 2018 series by Wendy Ruderman and Barb Laker from the Philadelphia Inquirer and Daily News, who won a Pulitzer in 2013. And this story was called Toxic City, where they looked at toxic conditions in the Philadelphia school system, unbelievably so. But they couldn't get in the schools. The administration wouldn't let them in. So they found teachers who were willing to collect samples. They trained them in the scientific methods to collect those samples, got the samples, took them to a lab. And the one example I found, I think for asbestos in one school, 100,000 parts per million is considered an emergency. 8.5 million was the number that they got. It was so severe that in the middle of their investigation, they called the schools and said, you have a real problem here. They felt ethically they couldn't let this condition continue. So that is a pretty creative way to deal with not being able to go undercover themselves. You get people on the inside. As with Kim's book, a lot of these women did. They talked to the factory workers, they talked to other people. So that's the situation now.
Yeah, and there were many cases then and now where I think that the fact of being a woman, presenting as a woman, gave them access either in a very literal way, they were able to go places where men were simply not allowed, or they were able to build rapport and find, talk their way into situations that men might not have been able to. I'm curious, and this is a question for both of you, do you feel that your stories, the stories you choose, are in some ways influenced by your gender?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Kim.
I think, so I am not a daily newspaper reporter. And I worked for a newspaper for 2 years when I was right out of college, and then, have done different forms of reporting since. But I think particularly at the start of my career, I was very wary of reporting on anything that could be perceived as an issue predominantly of interest to women, because I thought it was like a career breaker. I thought, you would be siloed on, the women's page or the home page. And my perception was at least that those stories weren't taken as seriously. I think that a lot of times work by women is less valued, and then it's sort of exponentially less valued if it's work by women about women. It really struck me a number of years ago, when Catherine Bigelow was the first woman to win an Oscar for directing. But what she won an Oscar for directing was Hurt Locker, which was a story about a man in a very male dominated environment. Not in any way a story that featured predominantly women's concerns. And I think it was taken seriously for that reason. That was one of the things that I was curious about the stunt reporters, because not only they were women, they were writing overtly about being women and of topics where women were at the center, the condition of female factory workers. So I think that I've moved away from that a little bit, clearly more willing to write about women. I just read this whole book about it, but certainly at the start of my career, I perceived it as something that I just did not want to touch at all when I was trying to establish myself.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty common thing among women in journalism, and especially when you're starting out, God forbid you end up on the features page. Although you see some very fabulous writing on a lot of features pages. I remember once reporting from Afghanistan when a male colleague kind of groaned when I was, telling what my stories for the day were. Oh God, not another story about women, only 50% of the population. So that was a reaction. But the flip side of that was I could get into homes and talk to women in a way that male reporters never would have been allowed to. Likewise, in rural parts of Pakistan, men just flat weren't allowed in. Yeah. So it was really advantageous in that way. As for stories I chose, probably lean towards some women's issues. It was very helpful when I was reporting on the mishandling of sexual assault cases at the University of Montana and in Missoula. I think the women I talked to were probably more comfortable talking to a woman. So that was helpful. But there was a phrase in your book that just struck me, and I wrote it down because it's so true and is still true today. The revelation that one has been underestimated is one of the pleasures of undercover reporting, particularly for young women, so often underestimated. And I would say that goes for women of all ages. I would just be like, okay, sucker, keep talking because I'm writing it all down.
Well, it was interesting to me because I thought that I was writing a book predominantly about history, but then when I would tell people what I was writing about, it turned out that a number of women writers that I'd known had tried things similar to this, like not early on in their careers, like not necessarily getting committed to an insane asylum and not necessarily like going into disguise and lying to people. But for an example, a female journalist friend of mine, right after she was out of journalism school, took on an extra job waitressing at a strip club because she knew that it was the week of the Republican convention. And so she wanted to report on all the Republicans who were there. This was very much like the moral majority years. And she did. And, it was a great story. So, she wasn't lying. It was her real job for those weeks. But I think, that she was attracted to it for those reasons. And I was surprised at the number of women writers that I knew who had taken that measure of power for themselves.
Did the women you talked to ever, were they ever aware that they were carrying on a legacy?
I don't know that they were. I mean, so I sort of polled a lot of female journalists of my acquaintance, like, how do you feel about Nellie Bly? And like a number of them like really liked Nellie Bly and felt like they were working in the tradition of Nellie Bly. Most of them had not heard of these other women, but even more than people feeling like they were working in the tradition of Nellie Bly, I think there's this kind of cultural character of the like intrepid girl reporter, which actually was started at this time, which I think a lot of women carry in their heart, like whether or not they're modeling themselves on Nellie Bly, on Harriet the Spy, on Lois Lane. But there's very much this sense of like, it's a way to be like brave and in the world. And I think a lot of them carried that.
I would think that I was struck by that, both about the women in your book and today. Reporting's fun. It's super interesting. As you said, you're out in the world, you get out of your own comfort zone and you get glimpses into other people's lives, which I just was one of the joys of the work for me. And I think for a lot of people. So and especially for women when, you tend to be slotted into these safer spaces. And it's like, no, let's get out of that.
Hey,
and it's
Michelle,
my job to get out of that.
Yeah.
Michelle, can I ask you your own question, because you are such a noted and illustrious reporter? I wonder like how your sense of being a woman plays into how you presented yourself and which stories you've chosen to cover over the course of your career.
Well, it's interesting. I thanks for asking. I have been thinking about it, especially since I read your book, and I've certainly done lots of what one could call immersion reporting as a science reporter, because I've gone into the field with any number of scientists and field teams and spent lots of time in bouncing around in pickup trucks and so forth. I don't know that I had I don't know if my gender gave me particular access or gave me or influenced me to choose certain stories over others. What I do know is that when I started out as a reporter, I was very shy. And I always hung on to this quote from Joan Didion. It reminded me of what both of you were saying earlier, where she describes herself sitting on a bed in a hotel room, afraid to pick up the phone. And she says something to the effect of, my only advantage as a reporter is that people never understood that my presence was contrary to their best interests. And it always was. And so I think sometimes women can exploit the stereotype of themselves as inoffensive or eager to please. And myself as kind of an introvert and a shy person, I learned that was perhaps a disadvantage in some ways, but also the secret advantage where people became very comfortable talking to me and would kind of forget that I was a reporter, but I always was.
I think people would be surprised to find out how many reporters are deeply shy.
Yeah.
The advantage to hiding behind the notebook. But when you read about the women in this book, my God, the things they did, it's just amazing.
Yeah, I mean, Kim, I maybe just give us a couple of examples of how extreme these adventures were, because we get an idea from your introductory reading, but they really put themselves in physical danger and endured some incredible discomforts.
Yeah, so another person that I think of, so Nellie Bly was super successful, very associated with Joseph Pulitzer's The New York World, which was really like the paper on the cutting edge that everyone wanted to be. So over on the other coast in San Francisco, William Randolph Hearst was starting his paper in the Pulitzer mold. He was the editor of the San Francisco Examiner. And this young reporter named Winifred Sweet showed up. And one of the first things that she did was there had been rumors about treatment of women at the public hospital. And, just very sort of like, they were euphemistic in the paper, but apparently there was a lot of abuse going on there. And so she stepped off one of the streetcars on Market Street in San Francisco and fainted, and just like hoped that someone would take her to the hospital. And she emptied out her purse, so there was no one to get in touch with, no relatives to contact. And she was put in the police wagon, which there was in absence, there was no ambulance. And yeah, she got taken to the hospital and she was treated for hysteria and just like physically abused. And yeah, the doctor freely explained his treatment of hysteria to the newspaper, which was basically like slap it out of the women, that it's not a real thing. And so he was ultimately fired, but she was in the hospital where they were giving her medicines and very much completely under their power. So that was just one of the other examples of the kinds of things that people were doing. So.
One thing I really appreciate about your book is that you, as I said, rescue these women from stereotype, but you don't portray them as perfect. And
No.
they weren't perfect. Yeah. They did things that we would today consider unethical, but they also did things that perhaps even in their time were considered a bit, they stretched the facts. They made certain decisions that we might consider not so wise today. Could you talk a little bit about that complexity?
Yeah, I mean, I think like they were all human, right? And I felt like both at the time and in history, they were given less credit than they were due, right? So they were treated as having been less important than they were. Their actions had the most negative light cast on them. And so one of the experiments of the book was, well, what if we cast a more positive light on them? What happens? What kind of comes into relief? And how do things look? And so definitely not perfect, but what if we treat them the same way that we treat Upton Sinclair, who's considered, pioneering muckraker? What if we treat them the same way that we treat Jacob Riis, who certainly comes under a lot of criticism for his photographs of the tenements now and his work on, the book How the Other Half Lives. But at the same time, he's still getting credit for being a pioneering muckraker, even though his sensibilities are not the sensibilities that we would have at the time. So yeah, I mean, I guess like I just wanted them to be treated the same as the men were who were doing the same kind of work. Another example is Stephen Crane, who's probably most best known for his novel, The Red Badge of Courage, completely taken seriously as like a literary man, right? Like Brooks taught in high school, all the respect to Stephen Crane. He was doing exactly the same kind of work that these women were doing. He worked for the New York Journal. He did the sort of reporting on the Tenderloin that they were doing. It appeared on the same pages in the same sections. So yeah, it was a little bit of an experiment of saying like, what if we give them the same respect as these guys while still like critiquing them for the genuine things that they needed to be critiqued for?
right, place them in the tradition, which they somehow have gotten because of their gender and have gotten snipped out of. And it is frustrating when you read your account and realize how that they were not a departure. They were, working in the evolving tradition of journalism and advancing it in really important ways. And it's so frustrating to think, oh, and then, a few decades later, a bunch of men came up with something called new journalism that really owed so much to these stunt reporters. Can you talk about a little bit about that unacknowledged connection?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I said early on, Tom Wolfe, presented his manifesto called The New Journalism, where he laid out what he saw as the work of a whole bunch of different writers, mostly male, but he included Joan Didion, that was happening in the 60s and 70s. And he really saw it as having 4 points. And one was, scene-based construction. One was lots of dialogue. One was a distinct point of view, which is, sometimes it means that the author is a character, and sometimes it means that the author's character and opinions just come through in language and perspective. And then what he called like status detail, which was just what people are wearing, what furniture they have, how they're presenting themselves to the world. And I really took that to heart. Like, that was the kind of journalism that I wanted to do when I learned about it in college. But yeah, it was just fascinating to see that these women were doing all of those exact same things, and that, other people were doing them as well. One of my favorite works of creative nonfiction is Zora Neale Hurston's Of Mules and Men, where, it's, under the umbrella of anthropology, but she is completely offering her own perspective and like this unique take and putting herself as a character and writing scenes with vivid language about her experiences. So.
Gwen, go ahead.
I'm curious about something, and maybe both of you can talk to it, is when you talk about sort of the historic disrespect that these women faced and that many women journalists still face, we saw it during the previous administration at the press conferences. Women were frequently singled out for derision. Is there a way that you've handled that in your own careers? And is there advice you'd give to young women journalists starting out? When that comes up, what do you do?
Wow. Yeah. I feel like turning that back onto you, because I feel like you would have better advice. I mean, I think the only thing that I've seen in my career is that I've been increasingly braver about writing about issues that are specific to women. As I kind of mentioned initially, I really shied away from it first. But I'm sympathetic to women who want to establish themselves in that way. And it's not like that bias doesn't still exist. I think it's still very present. So I don't know that, I would say to a 22-year-old, it's your responsibility as someone who, wants to be a pioneering woman writer to write about these certain things. I think people have to find their own path, but I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think I've been fairly lucky in that I've tended to work in pretty small newsrooms with on pretty intimate terms with people where, we were all treated as individuals rather than slotted, judged for our gender or our other demographic qualities, whatever they might be. But that's not to say I haven't experienced sexism or witnessed sexism, often unconscious sexism in I work as an editor now and occasionally, have become much more aware of the gender balance of bylines in all kinds of publications. And I think often, are you familiar with the studies of where people are asked to estimate the gender balance of crowd scenes in movies? And if there's something like more than 10 or 20% women in the crowd, people think, oh, it's mostly women. And so there's this perception when, as we strive toward some kind of balance in, whether it be bylines or space or, prestige or pay equity in publications, that I think there is this unconscious sense of, women are taking over. and that, that pushback is still happening. As I said, I've been lucky, I feel like, to have mostly skirted that myself just because of the circumstances in which I worked, but I've certainly witnessed it.
I think I've seen it a lot with, especially politicians or people in power, almost bullying young women. And I would say probably young reporters in general. I don't want to put that just on women. Like, how dare you ask that question? Trying to get them to back off, and sometimes almost physically looming, like stepping way too close. And, for myself, it was like waving a red flag. I would sort of plant my feet and go, okay, we're just going to ask this question again and keep asking it. But yeah, I think what I've told young reporters is be aware of that and be prepared for it, have your defense ready when that happens so you can just go on. I've been really fortunate, likewise, to work in newsrooms with a lot of women in positions of power, a lot of role models, and that's been enormously important.
One thing that I would just like to say when sort of thinking about these stunt reporters and now is, like, again, one of the innovations of their reporting was that they were reporting on like what was happening in women's spaces and what was happening in women's lives, and that there was a lot of hunger for that. And I feel like I'm still hungry for that. Like, I'm still not getting enough of that from the daily newspapers. Like, I want to know about the experience of women trying to access abortion now. I want to know about women playing professional sports. I want to know about like the experience of women in predominantly female workspaces. I remember there was this nail salon expose in the New York Times a number of years ago, and that just felt like such a revelation just for the reason. I mean, it was in these kind of like overlooked female dominated spaces, and the reporter really like opened it up and showed us what was going on there.
Yeah,
so I just would love so much more of it.
Yeah, I feel the same way. And don't those kinds of stories speak to the value of diversity in the newsroom on all axes? Because, and it's not that people always cover things that they feel closest to, but they know that there are stories in worlds that reporters who have grown up in different communities who look different may not even be aware of. And it also speaks to diversity, the need for diversity in the power structure, because someone can know about a story and not be able to, and we've all had the experience of not being able to sell a story that we know is important to an editor in Manhattan who's like, why should I care? And so having, diversity up and down the masthead is just so important to revealing more of the world, which is, of course, the point of journalism in the first place.
One of the examples in the book, Ida B. Wells, who is such a personal hero, but the fact that, I'd known, obviously she'd written about lynchings and really just exposed the horrific aspects of those. But I didn't realize it was her writing overtly about consensual relationships between white women and Black men that damn near got her killed. It got her newspaper destroyed. The bravery of that woman is just amazing. But again, she was able to write about that because she knew, that subject, and incredible.
Yeah, one of the fascinating things was reading her early journals and her sense that like of what she could say and what she shouldn't say. Like she's
Yeah.
very actively wrestling it. That she's like, I'm so angry at this moment that like if I say something, like physical harm is going to come to myself. And then you see like over the years, like she's just eventually just like, I just have to say it. Like, you know, this paper won't have it, but I will, you know, work out a way to own my own newspaper or publish my own book or get my friends to support the publication of my book. But it was really interesting to watch her to wrestle through those questions.
Yeah, that physical bravery was just, it's so impressive.
Well, and time and again, I think the most important thing about these stories, they wrought change.
Mhm.
You know, they really badly needed change to any number of fields that where these conditions just had gone on forever and unnoticed.
Yeah, I mean, and they were really, you know, practicing the first principle of journalism, which is to hold power accountable. And they were in spaces and places where power had never been held accountable. And all of a sudden these women were, you know, putting themselves in the mental hospital and documenting you know, just how unfettered this power, this, you know, this hidden exercise of power was. And yeah, it shocked people. And it also sold a lot of papers.
It sold a lot of papers, and maybe as a result, another interesting thing was like how much the papers backed them up. Like they really had, you know, complete support of the papers, and you know that businesses were coming in where Nell Nelson had been exposing like their filthy, corrupt practices, and you know, suing the newspaper or whatever. And you know, they just were really backed up by the editors. It was a trend of the time that both Pulitzer and Hearst were doing, where what they wanted to do was hold power accountable because that was what they saw the purpose of papers as being. But it was very inspiring to see actually how much support, editorial support, these women got. So.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously some of it was self-interested by the owners, because it was, you know, if no one had bought the stories, then they might not have gotten that kind of support. But they were able to tell these really powerful stories in a way that made people care, made people want to pick up these stories and buy these papers. And so it was a, you know, in this case, it was a happy marriage of public service and commercial success.
Yeah. One of the things about the book overall was inspiring. We have a guest. It was inspiring to me about journalism in general at a time when, you know, so many papers are just being decimated of resources. It reminded me again just how important this business is. Again, you know, the things that were exposed, the changes that were brought about because they were exposed. As you just said, Michelle, this is what we do. And it's important.
Yeah, on the one hand, it was like so inspiring to read about these women and their work and the vision for journalism of the time. But I'll tell you my most depressing fact, which was that one of them later became a magazine editor. And so I read her letters when she's like soliciting, you know, like 1902, when she's soliciting articles from people, and the pay rate has not gone up. She was offering to pay in 1902 what some people are received to pay now. So sorry for that little view into the world, but there it is.
The economic model of journalism.
Yeah.
Still does not exist.
Yeah.
Yeah, at the same time, I mean, a slightly more hopeful spin on things was that, I mean, yes, I think this work remains underpaid, under-rewarded, but and I don't want to make this sound diminishing, but in a way, all it took was for these women to look somewhere that no one else was looking.
Right.
And they exposed these incredible stories. And that to me is something we can take with us into the future, because there are always, you know, more and more there are places like that. Now there are digital places where no one's looking, as well as physical places. And sometimes just that very, you know, this doing journalism 101 in a place where no one else is doing it. And I think of, you know, rural places that are losing their paper, you know, those kinds of places can benefit hugely from a little bit of applied journalism. Kim, I also want to encourage those of you who are listening to drop questions in the Q&A. When we get some questions, we'll switch over to those questions. We'll keep chatting until that time. Kim, I wanted to ask you a bit about the title, because as I told you before we came on, I got about halfway through the book and I said, aha, there's a double meaning to the title. And I thought it was very clever. So tell us a bit about the evolution.
Yeah. Well, also, as we were mentioning before the call, like, I have never gotten the title that I wanted for one of my books. And Gwen was saying that you also have not gotten the title that you wanted for one of your books. So the original title for this book was Ink Stained. And it was partially from this quote, which I love, by Nathaniel Hawthorne, where he's like tearing his hair out that all these female novelists are more successful than he is, and that everyone's buying their books, and he calls them like these ink-stained Amazons who are just gonna like take over the field of literature, like waving their petticoats. So I loved it for that reason. And then also I had in my head like the phrase ink-stained wretches as like being referring to journalists. And I thought it was interesting because they were a little bit like stained by their profession. Like it was not quite respectable what they were doing. But the consensus was that it was too negative. And so we just went through so many different versions, from like the way boring to like the women in, from like the women in the newsroom, you know, was like one. And then one was going to be like girl exclamation point, stunt exclamation point, reporters exclamation point as like the other end. And I was sort of interested in a one-word title. So I think I kept like just throwing out, you know, brazen and undaunted and like things that had been unfortunately used for other things, but sensational stuck. And at first I was like, okay, but now I really, really like it. So I've come around.
Yeah, I loved how it spoke to both, you know, that this was sensational in the most familiar way, but also because of the physical immersion of these women in the places where they were reporting, they were doing sensational reporting in the sense that they were using their senses, all of their senses, much more than many of the stories that were being published at the time. And that's something I think that all journalists learn in the early years of reporting. You know, use all your senses. You know, don't just listen. Don't just write down what's said. What can you see? What can you hear? What can you feel? And perhaps that's something that we all inherited from girl stunt reporters.
I mean, it was interesting because the primary slur at the time was not the girl and was not the stunt. It was that they were called like sensation reporters, and their work was dismissed as being sensational. And it was an interesting thing to me to think through, well, like it was considered not desirable to appeal to the reader's senses. Like that was their base instincts, right? You were supposed to appeal to the intellect. But I was like, well, I'm always telling my students, my writing students, to use all their senses. So maybe there's some kind of contradiction there, or discomfort with the senses.
Yeah, and I mean, people didn't really, not just don't talk about the senses, but don't talk about the body, really. You know, don't, especially not the female body, my God. Please don't acknowledge that you have one or anyone else has one.
And that was another thing which made these women's work slightly less than completely respectable, because they did talk about, you know, Nellie Bly is like, oh, at the asylum, they threw us in this freezing cold bath and my hair was a mess and I was shivering. And it does reference their embodiedness quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. Which shocked people, but again, probably sold a lot of papers because people were saying, what is, you read this scandalous story? Please. Tell me more about this scandalous story.
Yes, yes, indeed.
You know, we're still seeing we're seeing a similar pattern, or there have been, maybe not a pattern, but there have certainly been prominent cases where women have done things that would, if a man had done them, would immediately be respected as very courageous immersion reporting, but has instead been dismissed as, or not dismissed, but has instead been labeled as memoir or as a different sort of and lower status reporting. Gwen, have you seen instances of that in the profession? And Kim, maybe you could speak a little bit about your observations as well.
Gwen, do you have an example, or should I, or do you want me to?
I'm sorry, my connection just cut out for a second.
Oh, shoot, I'm sorry.
I missed the question. Sorry about that.
I was speaking about, just referring to the fact that even today, women who do the kind of reporting that that would, if a man were doing it, would immediately be given a lot of prestige and a lot of kudos, or sometimes, you know, have to label under lower status labels like reporting, feature writing, that kind of thing.
And my connection's still cutting out. So Kim, I'll toss that one to you.
Okay, I will
right now.
So one example that I talk about in the book is there's a writer named Suki Kim who went to North Korea, and she worked there as a teacher undercover. And she came out and she wrote a book called Without You, There Is No Us, about the experience of these elite young men at this school, and really the complete impoverishment of their learning about their country and the world. And they have this very old technology, and it's just like a horrible situation. So when she emerged with this book, which she had written, you know, incredibly danger to herself, it wasn't treated as investigative journalism. It wasn't treated as this important document in our understanding about North Korea. One, it was labeled as a memoir, which is very odd labeling for someone going undercover in North Korea. And then two, it was just like completely dismissed as non-serious. The headline in the New York Times was "Telling Tales Out of School," kind of positioning her as like a schoolgirl, not as, you know, someone who is a serious reporter. And I think if a man had written the story, he probably would have won the Pulitzer Prize. So that's just one example that I can think of.
Shocking.
Yeah.
Example I thought of, I appear to be back now, was Ronan Farrow, who shared the Pulitzer for the Me Too reporting with Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey from the New York Times. But Ronan Farrow is the Me Too reporter. You know, I think in the world of journalism, we're familiar with all three of them, but beyond in the larger world, you know, he's the one who gets the recognition for it. And you know, all respect to him, but makes my blood boil a little.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, we still are you know, laboring under what are sometimes the contradictions of commercial concerns and the concerns of public service in journalism. And, you know, sometimes when there's a reporter like Ronan Farrow, who is not only incredibly talented, but, you know, a child of Hollywood and has all this, you know, interesting backstory and charisma, he is immediately elevated, not only by the media reporting on him, but, you know, the media he works for, because that is useful to the financial success of journalism. But it's, I mean, especially in that case, it's unfortunate for the incredibly talented and hardworking reporters who didn't get that kind of attention.
I did see that there was one question in the Q&A, which was, what positive changes are you seeing for women in journalism today? Okay. And I just would like to say, on the flip side, I don't think that probably even 5 years ago, you could have had female reporters writing about sexual harassment in a way that would have been taken so seriously and would have gotten so much front page coverage. You saw all the hurdles that were like in place of getting that story out there. And I feel like it was sort of like this moment in time was maybe like the first moment in time that could have happened. And I think you still see pushback to women writing, even reporting on sexual harassment, even if they're not writing about their own. But I do think it was a great thing that story was able to get out there by those reporters.
Yeah, and I mean, perhaps it hasn't been, too many more years ago that kind of story would have just been impossible, written by anyone. And so I think we have come a long way. And I mean, but as you say, I think there are still cases where I think there was a case at the Washington Post not too long ago where a woman who had herself experienced sexual harassment was put on leave for talking about that experience because she was also covering sexual harassment stories, and that was seen as some kind of conflict of interest. So we're still sometimes having to fight for our legitimacy as reporters.
And that just brought up a personal experience. When I was in Colorado and the Kobe Bryant sexual assault allegations came up, I was assigned to that story with a team of people. And I had some objections to an angle they were pursuing. And I was called into a room with 3 or 4 male editors and asked if my problem with the story was whether I had ever been sexually assaulted.
Wow.
I blew up. It was just appalling. So that angle ended up not being pursued, and it was worth the fight. But so I think that sort of thing still comes. That was a while ago, but I would not be surprised if that sort of thing doesn't still come up.
Right. There's still the assumption that the white straight man is the ideal of objectivity. The ideal of the objective report of the objective observer, and everyone else is slightly compromised. Hopefully we're starting to understand that everyone is everyone is shaped by their own experience, and their observations are shaped by their own experience. Well, we are getting toward the end of our time. Is there anything either of you would like to say in closing? Kim, is there anything you would like to leave us with about these women? And again, I really encourage all of you to pick up Sensational and read these wonderful interwoven stories, which say so much about their era and ours.
No, I mean, just that, there was a lot of pushback and they were forgotten for a long amount of time. But for me, it was ultimately a very inspiring story. Again, just because Nellie Bly just opened this door a crack, right? She just opened this door a crack of opportunity for women to do something serious in the newsroom. And the women just flooded in. And some of them had long careers in journalism. Some of them used the open door to become novelists or editors or whatever. But it just shows you what a little open door can do, which I appreciated.
Yeah, it's almost as if you get the feeling that there are all these women just waiting for someone to take the first step. And as unusual as it can seem like what she did, there were dozens and dozens and dozens of women waiting to do exactly the same thing. So it's really exciting to think about how that may apply to in our times as well. Well, thank you everyone who joined us today. It's really just delightful to see you here, and it's been wonderful to talk with both Kim and Gwen about these issues that are very close to our heart, and I think probably should be close to everyone's, because what we're really talking about is how stories get told and who tells them and why and what power they can and still do have to make a difference. So I hope you'll check out Kim's book, and I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the festival.
Yeah, thank you guys. Before we sign off, I just want to thank our event sponsors, Arts Missoula and Montana Press Monthly. Also, Fact and Fiction Books. You can pick up festival titles from Fact and Fiction, both online and in person. And when you do, make sure to mention the code MBF to give 20% of your purchase back to the festival. You can also donate directly on our website, montanabookfestival.com. We have merch available there. You can also just donate directly. Thank you so much for Kim, Gwen, and Michelle for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And on behalf of Montana Book Festival, I would like to thank everyone who attended for joining us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.